Welcome, dear listener. Welcome to a special journey. Lean back, take a deep breath, and gently let the day fade away. Imagine yourself sitting comfortably, perhaps already in bed, and your eyelids slowly growing heavy. Today, we're taking you to a time long past, to the Middle Ages, an era so distant yet surprisingly close in many ways. The Middle Ages. The very word conjures up images: towering castles, mysterious monasteries, narrow streets, knights in shining armor, and peasants in the fields. But the Middle Ages weren't just a chapter in history books. Above all, it was the everyday life of millions of people who lived in a world that knew no electricity, no modern machines, and no digital communication. It was a world of candlelight, church bells, and simple, often arduous work. And perhaps you're wondering, what was life really like back then? What did a medieval town smell like? What did dawn sound like in the countryside when the first roosters crowed and the mist lay over the fields? And what was it like to usher in night after a long day, when outside only the howling of the wind and the crackling of the hearth fire could be heard? In the following chapters, we want to immerse ourselves in this everyday life together, step by step, hour by hour. We will imagine how a day began, how it unfolded, and how it ended. In doing so, we will not only look at major events, but above all at the little things, the meals, the sounds, the work, the joys, and also the worries of the people. The Middle Ages, like every era, was a web of contrasts. It was a time of confinement and expansiveness, of fear and hope, of superstition and faith. The streets could be dirty and noisy, while the monastery gardens lay still and peaceful. In the big cities, the cries of merchants mingled with the aroma of freshly baked bread, and with less pleasant smells that would be almost unbearable today. Yet, within all these contrasts, lay a profound tranquility, for the rhythm of life was clearly dictated by nature, by the seasons, and by the beat of church bells. There was no rush as we know it today, no constant hum of machines, no incessant ringing of telephones. Life flowed more slowly, and perhaps for that very reason, it was felt more intensely. Before we begin our journey, I invite you to pause for a moment. Close your eyes if you like. Take a deep breath. Imagine you are standing in a village many hundreds of years ago. Simple wooden houses surround you. A well sits in the small square, a dog barks somewhere, and smoke rises from a chimney. The air smells of damp earth, hay, and wood. It is quieter than today, yet this silence is not empty. It is filled with small, subtle sounds. The splashing of the well, the rustling of the wind in the trees, the distant ringing of a bell. You are invited to immerse yourself in this world as it was. Rough, simple, sometimes harsh, but also full of warmth, community, and stories. For the people of the Middle Ages did not only live, they told stories. Around the fire, in the taverns, in the fields, stories accompanied their lives. And so, today, we too want to tell a story. The story of everyday life. You might notice that some things sound familiar. The laughter of children, the toil of a workday, the need for security in the evening. All of this connects us to the people of that time. And yet, there is much that seems foreign to us, almost as if from another world. This mixture of familiarity and distance is what makes the Middle Ages so fascinating. If you like, you can imagine yourself stepping into a medieval house. The door creaks, the floor is made of packed earth, the air is smoky from the open hearth fire. It isn't large, perhaps just one room for the whole family. But this is where life unfolded. where people ate, slept, worked, and told stories. Daily life was modest, but not empty. It was filled with rituals, with small tasks, with the familiar routines that gave life structure. Our journey through the Middle Ages will not be turbulent, but tranquil, almost like a walk at night. We will wander through the streets of cities, walk across farmers' fields, peek into houses, and enter churches. We will hear how the bells marked the course of the day, how the market came alive, and how the village fell silent again in the evening. And as we observe all this, your mind can slowly find peace. For these stories are not only there to impart knowledge, they are also meant to accompany you, soothe you, and help you let go of the day's thoughts. Thus begins our journey. A journey through everyday life in the Middle Ages, not through the great battles or the names of kings, but through the simple life that tells us more about the people of that time than any history book. So sit back. Let yourself be carried away by the images and words. Let your thoughts wander, like smoke rising from a chimney into the sky. And when you eventually close your eyes and drift off to sleep, let these voices of the Middle Ages gently accompany you. Welcome to the stories of the night. Welcome to everyday life in the Middle Ages. Morning in the Middle Ages didn't begin with the ringing of an alarm clock, nor with the buzzing of a cell phone lying next to the bed. It began with the rhythm of nature, with the first light of day, the crowing of roosters, and the ringing of bells. People awoke when the sun colored the horizon, when dawn slowly chased away the darkness of night. Imagine yourself lying on a simple straw mattress. The night was cool. Perhaps the wind whistled through small cracks in the wall. You are covered with coarse woolen blankets, and your family sleeps beside you. It's cramped, but this closeness also provides warmth. The first sound of morning is the crackling in the hearth as the embers of the night flare up again because someone is adding more wood. Smoke drifts through the roof, sometimes through the room, and you breathe in the smell of burning wood. The village slowly awakens. A dog barks in the distance, chickens cluck, and somewhere a rooster begins to loudly announce the new day. The air outside is fresh and cool, damp with morning dew. When you step outside, you feel the earth still soft and wet beneath your feet. Hear the last raindrops pattering on the thatched roofs. A light mist hangs over the fields, and the village seems shrouded in a soft veil. Breakfast in the Middle Ages was simple. No coffee, no tea, no lavish buffet. There was dark bread, often baked from rye, sometimes some porridge made from oats or barley. Children often had a bowl of warm soup or thin porridge, while the adults drank a weak beer, so-called thin beer, with very little alcohol, but nutritious and cleaner than water. Sometimes there was also cheese, or a piece of fruit if the season allowed. The meal wasn't large, but it provided strength for the day ahead. In many homes, the morning began with a short prayer. People folded their hands, gave thanks for the new day, and asked for protection and blessings. Faith was deeply woven into daily life. Not only the church bells, but also the first words spoken in the morning reminded people that their lives were part of something larger. The clothes were put on. Simple, practical. Linen or wool shirts and trousers for the men. Long dresses and shawls for the women. In winter it was often cold. The houses offered little protection, so people wrapped themselves in extra layers of fabric. Children wore smaller versions of the adults' clothes. While the adults prepared for work, the children often had to take on small tasks. They fetched water from the well, carried wood for the fire, and fed the animals. The clinking of buckets, the bleating of goats, and the lowing of cows were as much a part of the morning as the crowing of the rooster. The village awoke step by step, house by house. You could hear the chopping of axes and the shouting of people across the fields. The morning wasn't loud, but it was full of vibrant sounds. Sounds that connected an entire village. Imagine yourself walking along the narrow path, past the low wooden houses with their thatched roofs. A woman kneels in front of one house, drawing water from a bucket, while children laugh and play beside her, even before work begins. The smell of freshly baked bread wafts from another house, mingling with the smoke from the chimney. It's a simple, yet comforting start to the day. Not everyone began their morning in the same way. Farmers had to get out to the fields early to begin work, while the sun was still mild. In the town, craftsmen opened their workshops, prepared their tools, and merchants set up their wares in the market. But one thing was the same everywhere. Morning was a new beginning, a moment of preparation for the day, sustained by rituals that provided a sense of security. The church bells played a special role in this. They rang not only for special occasions, but also to structure the rhythm of the day. The ringing of the bells in the morning was a signal. It's time to begin the day. Time to start work. This ringing connected people. It was the sound that awakened the village or town. And as the sun slowly rose higher, the mist settled over the fields. The first rays filtered through the branches of the trees, casting long shadows on the paths. Mornings in the Middle Ages were not rushed. They were characterized by simple actions, by a natural tranquility. Everything happened in a rhythm that hardly changed for centuries. If you close your eyes now, you can imagine how the day begins. The sounds of the animals, the clinking of buckets, the crackling of the wood in the hearth. Perhaps you hear the murmur of a prayer or the laughter of children. It is a world quieter than ours, and yet so full of life. This is how mornings began in the Middle Ages. Slowly, simply, embedded in nature and community. And as the sun rises higher, as the day takes shape, we open the door to the tasks that lay before humankind, the work in the countryside that formed the backbone of medieval life. Life in the Middle Ages was primarily a life in the countryside. About 9 out of 10 people lived in villages, surrounded by fields, forests, and meadows. Farm work was the foundation upon which society rested. Without farmers, there would have been no food, no markets, no cities. Imagine you are standing at the edge of a field when morning is still young. The sun is slowly rising, the mist is lifting, and the earth smells of dampness. Birds are chirping in the trees while the farmers are already beginning their work. You can hear the creaking of wooden plows, the pounding of oxen, the rhythmic beat of hooves on the soft ground. The fields were laid out in long strips, often used communally. This was known as the three-field system. One part was sown in the spring, another in the autumn, and the third lay fallow. This was how they secured yields and tried to avoid depleting the soil. The work began with plowing. Heavy wooden plows, sometimes with iron points, were pulled by oxen or horses. Farmers laboriously guided them through the earth, step by step, row by row. It was strenuous, but the cracking of the soil, the even breathing of the animals, the rhythmic shouts of the men had something calming about them. Besides the men, women, and children also worked. Women gathered herbs, helped with weeding and harvesting, ground grain, or prepared meals for the helpers. Children chased birds away from the fields, gathered firewood, or drove the animals to pasture. Everyone had a task, and the community was tightly knit. The village lived together. Successes and failures were shared. In summer, the harvest was the highlight. Cutting the stalks with sickles, binding the sheaves, stacking them into stooks in the fields. All this happened during long days, under sun and sweat. The fields were imagined as a sea of gold, rustling in the wind. And while the work was hard, there was also joy in it. The laughter of the people, the songs they sang to keep the rhythm. Sometimes simple melodies rang out, accompanied by the clacking of sickles. It was the music of everyday life, music that transformed work into community. But it wasn't just grain that was cultivated. Vegetables, legumes, cabbage, turnips, all of these were part of the diet. Herbs grew in gardens, parsley, dill, thyme. They not only added flavor, but also served as medicine. The air could be filled with the scent of freshly harvested herbs, mingling with the smell of earth and sweat, and livestock also played an important role. Cows provided milk, sheep wool, pigs meat, and chickens eggs. Even in the morning, the animals were driven out to the pastures. The tinkling of small bells accompanied them, and when walking across the fields, one could hear this soft, soothing ringing everywhere. In the evening, they were brought back to barns that reeked of hay and animals. The year in the countryside was a cycle, governed by the seasons. In spring, they sowed seeds. In summer, they tended the fields. In autumn, they harvested, and in winter, they rested, as best they could. But even in winter, there was work to be done. Chopping wood, securing supplies, feeding animals. People lived with nature, not against it. They depended on the rain, the sun, and the storms. A good summer could mean abundance, a rainy spring, hunger. This constant oscillation between hope and worry shaped their lives. And yet, despite all the hardship, there was also peace in this world. The steady thud of hammers, the rhythmic scraping of hoes, the shouts of people across the fields. It was a familiar, comforting tapestry of sound. If you closed your eyes, you could almost feel the pulse of the earth itself. Imagine you are walking across a freshly plowed field right now. The furrows stretch in long lines, and the soil smells of life. A farmer bends down, checking the seeds, while his children shoo away birds that are greedily pecking at the grain. At the edge of the field, a woman kneels, gathering herbs in a basket. The scene is simple, but there is beauty in its simplicity. Working in the fields was not just a burden. It provided structure, it provided community, it provided meaning. Those who plowed, sowed, and harvested knew they were feeding not only themselves, but the entire village. And in that responsibility lay pride. When the sun was high at midday, people took a break. They sat at the edge of the field, ate bread, cheese, sometimes a little bacon. They drank light beer or water, told stories, and laughed. The work was hard, but in those moments it was also a bond that connected people. In the afternoon, they continued working until the sun began to set. Then they drove the animals back, gathered their tools, and went together to the village. Their shoulders were tired, their hands rough, but their hearts were filled with the knowledge of having accomplished something. That was work in the countryside. Simple, hard, but embedded in a rhythm that provided stability. And as we look at these images, as we imagine a village living and working together, we can find peace. For in this constant cycle of sowing and reaping, of giving and receiving, lies something timeless, something that still touches us today. While fields dominated life in the countryside, life in the city was quite different. Medieval cities were small worlds unto themselves, surrounded by walls, crisscrossed by narrow alleyways, and filled with sounds, smells, and voices. Whoever stepped through a city gate left the wide, tranquil landscape behind and entered a dense network of trade, crafts, and community. Imagine walking through the gate of a medieval city early one morning. The heavy wooden gates creak, and a guard slowly raises his head, scrutinizing you. Beyond the walls, a different life unfolds. The streets are narrow, paved with rough stones, the houses standing close together. Some are made of wood, others of stone, with narrow windows and roofs that almost touch. The air is filled with a mixture of scents. The air smells of fresh bread being baked in the bakeries, of smoke rising from the chimneys, but also of animals, manure, and refuse washed down the gutters along the streets. It's not a pleasant smell, but it's as much a part of the city as the ringing of bells. The sounds are varied. Merchants call out their wares, hawking vegetables, fish, or fabrics. The clang of hammers echoes from the blacksmiths' workshops. Children run through the alleys, their footsteps echoing. And somewhere in the distance, a monk sings his first prayers of the day in the church. The cities were primarily inhabited by craftsmen and merchants. Blacksmiths, bakers, tanners, weavers, shoemakers. Each street had its own sound, its own rhythm. The workshops were dark and cramped. You could see men shaping iron, sparks flying. You could hear women weaving, the rhythmic beating of the loom. Every movement was work, but also a piece of everyday music. The markets were the heart of the city. Once or several times a week, merchants set up their stalls. Colorful cloths fluttered in the wind. Baskets full of apples, onions, or herbs stood ready. The air was filled with the scent of spices brought from distant lands: pepper, cinnamon, saffron. For people in the Middle Ages, such scents were something special, almost magical. The market was not only a place of trade, but also a meeting place. People met friends, exchanged news, and heard rumors. Life in the city was closer, denser, and louder than in the countryside. The houses stood tall, the alleyways narrow. If you looked up, you often saw the sky only as a thin line between the rooftops. Sometimes boards or fabrics hung over the streets to provide shade. The light fell refracted into the alleys, creating patterns of light and darkness. And yet, there were also places of peace. In the courtyards of the monasteries, where monks worked in the garden, silence reigned. Here, medicinal herbs grew, and the buzzing of bees mingled with the soft murmur of prayers. It was a contrast to the noisy city, a place where time seemed to slow down. Children played in the streets with wooden hoops, small stones, or balls. They laughed, shouted, and ran barefoot across the cobblestones. This, too, was part of city life, a constant commotion, full of energy and voices. But the city wasn't all joy. It was also a place of danger. Fire could spread quickly if the wooden houses were too close together. Diseases spread more easily when many people lived in close quarters. Yet even these downsides were part of the city's rhythm. People lived with it, just as we live with noise and hectic activity today. As the day progressed, the city grew ever more vibrant. The church bells set the rhythm, for mass, for work, for rest. The craftsmen worked, the merchants traded, the streets were bustling. Yet, through it all, a sense of familiarity, of repetition, persisted. Each day brought similar sounds, similar sights, and it was precisely this repetition that provided a sense of security. Imagine yourself continuing your walk through the city. You see a baker pulling steaming bread from the oven. Next to him sits a shoemaker, steadily sewing new shoes. A few steps further on, a blacksmith hammers, sparks flying in the darkness. It's like a mosaic. Every house, every workshop, every person a piece in this picture of city life. In the evening, as the sun set, the city changed. The markets emptied. The shops closed. The sounds grew quieter. Oil lamps or candles cast flickering light into the alleys. The smell of smoke and food filled the air. Voices could still be heard. Laughter from the taverns, soft murmurs in the houses. But slowly, a stillness settled over the city, like a veil covering everything. That was city life, full of sounds and smells, full of close quarters and encounters. A constant interplay of hustle and bustle and silence, of work and rest. And as we contemplate these images, we may remember, even within this commotion lay its own rhythm, its own order, a rhythm that sustained the people, day after day, year after year. When we think of the Middle Ages, we often picture knights and kings, grand castles and battles. But the true heart of everyday life beat in homes, in families, with women and children. They were the silent forces that sustained daily life, held the community together, and ensured stability through the small gestures of everyday life. Imagine a simple house, perhaps built only of wood, with a thatched roof. Inside, a fire crackles, carrying smoke into the room, and in a corner, a woman sits spinning wool. Her hands move calmly, almost in song, as she shapes the yarn. Beside her sits a child playing with a piece of wood, perhaps a small carved figure. It is an image of peace, of closeness, of everyday life. Women's tasks were manifold. They took care of the house, the children, and the food. They ground grain in heavy mills, kneaded dough and baked bread. They gathered herbs, washed clothes in the cold river water, and mended garments that had often been worn many times. They were doctors in their own right, knowing the properties of plants and roots, how to bandage wounds, and how to alleviate illnesses. Sometimes they mixed simple salves, whose herbal scent filled the room. But the women weren't only active in the home. In the countryside, they worked in the fields, helping with sowing and harvesting. In the cities, they ran small stalls in the market, selling vegetables, cheese, or fabrics. Some women worked as midwives, assisting with births and passing on their knowledge from generation to generation. Their lives were characterized by work, but also by a deep sense of connection to their families. The children played a special role. They weren't simply spectators. From a young age, they were part of everyday life. Even at a young age, they had to help out, carrying water, gathering wood, feeding animals. But between these chores, there was time for games. Children played with simple things, stones, bones, small pieces of wood. They rolled tires through the alleys, played tag in the fields, laughed loudly and carefree. The children's laughter was like a bright sound that made their hard lives easier. Imagine you are standing in a village in the afternoon. The adults are in the fields, while a few children play at the edge. A ball of fabric flies through the air, small hands clap, feet run through the dust. From afar, a mother calls out, asking for help, and immediately a child runs off, a bucket in hand. This constant interplay between play and duty was the children's life. Not all children had the same opportunities, however. Most grew up without schooling, learning through observation and imitation. They learned how to herd animals, chop wood, sew or spin. Only a few, mostly boys from wealthier families, could learn to read and write in monastery schools. There, they sat in cool rooms, listened to the monks, and practiced writing letters with quill and ink. For most children, however, education remained a dream, as distant as a castle on the horizon. The lives of women and children were not easy. The work was hard, the risks great. Childbirth was dangerous, and diseases could strike entire families. Yet, despite all the hardship, their daily lives were also filled with small moments of joy. Singing while spinning, laughing while playing, telling stories around the fire. These small moments provided warmth, comfort, and hope. Imagine a mother sitting by the hearth with her children in the evening. The fire crackles. The room is filled with golden light. She tells a story, perhaps about saints, perhaps about dragons or distant kings. The children listen, their eyes shining, as night falls outside. These stories were not just entertainment. They were also teachings, imparting values and keeping memories alive. Women and children were the silent bearers of life. Without them, the village, the town, could not have existed. They brought warmth to everyday life. They made life worth living. Their laughter, their diligence, their presence, all of this was like a quiet thread that held the community together. When we think of them today, we feel how familiar some things sound. A mother's care, a child's laughter, they are timeless. They have accompanied humankind for millennia. And even though the Middle Ages were harsh and rough, these constants, these simple yet profound feelings, remained. This is how the women and children lived, perhaps inconspicuous in the grand chronicles of history, yet irreplaceable in everyday life. And as we look at these pictures, we can find a measure of peace, a measure of warmth that still resonates today. The Middle Ages were not just a time of castles and markets, not just a life lived in fields and narrow streets. Above all, it was a time when faith was deeply interwoven with everyday life. Religion was not something separate, not just a visit to church on Sundays. It was the foundation upon which people built their lives. Imagine you are standing in front of a small village church early in the morning. The bells ring slowly, their sounds resonating through the clear air. A mist still hangs over the fields, and the ringing carries far, like a gentle reminder that a new day is beginning. For the people of that time, this ringing was more than just a sound. It was a signal, a rhythm, a connection between heaven and earth. The daily routine was shaped by the church. The hours of prayer, the so-called canonical hours, divided the day. Morning prayer, midday prayer, evening prayer. Even those who didn't live in a monastery observed these times. People folded their hands, murmured the Lord's Prayer, and made the sign of the cross. Religion was like an invisible thread that ran through the day, calm and constant. Faith was encountered everywhere in everyday life. Small crosses hung on the walls of houses. Wayside shrines or statues of saints stood by the roadside, which people greeted as they passed. People prayed for protection at work, blessed their food, and gave thanks for the harvest. Every important step in life, birth, marriage, death, was connected with rituals. Just as the fire in the hearth warmed the room, so religion warmed souls. But faith was not only comfort, it was also explanation. When it rained, it was a blessing from God. When the sun burned, it was a test, and when illness came, it was often seen as a punishment. Life was full of uncertainties, full of dangers, and religion offered answers that provided comfort, even if they didn't always explain. The atmosphere in the churches was special. Imagine stepping through the heavy door of a village church. Inside, it's cool. Light filters through small, colorful stained glass windows. Candles flicker, their wax dripping slowly. The air smells of smoke, incense, and old wood. The voices of the faithful echo as they pray together. It's a sound that goes deep, soothing, almost like a song repeated over and over. In the cities stood grand cathedrals, impressive and majestic. Their spires soared far above the rooftops, visible from afar. For the people, it was as if heaven itself were touching the earth. But even the smallest roadside chapels held significance. People knelt, said a silent prayer, perhaps laid down a flower. In this way, religion flowed into every gesture, into every day. Alongside the church, old beliefs persisted, superstitions, folklore. People wore amulets, believed in protective spells, and told stories of ghosts or witches. Sometimes Christian faith mingled with old pagan customs. For example, people blessed the fields, but at the same time, they placed small symbols in the earth to ward off misfortune. This mixture was part of life, not a contradiction, but a complement. The festivals of the year were also religious highlights. Easter, Christmas, Pentecost, they provided structure, joy, and variety. The whole village came together. They sang, they danced, they ate together. The church was always the center, the framework within which life took place. The ringing of the bells at Christmas, the fire on Easter night, these were symbols of hope and renewal. Religion was also expressed in art, in songs, in stories. The monks' chants, echoing softly in the monasteries, possessed a timeless quality. Latin words carried by melodies that flowed slowly and steadily. Closing your eyes, you could lose yourself in these sounds, as in a gentle dream. And yet, religion was not only something grand and powerful, something that seemed distant. It was also intimate, close. In a mother's simple prayer for her child, in a farmer's sign of the cross before plowing, in a woman's song as she gathered herbs, invoking the protection of a saint. They were small gestures that touched the heart, that offered reassurance. When night fell, when the village grew quiet, a final prayer often echoed through the houses. The candlelight flickered, and people lay down. They gave thanks for the day, prayed for a peaceful night, and for protection from danger. The words were simple, yet they acted like a cloak that enveloped souls. That was religion in the Middle Ages, omnipresent, comforting, and explanatory. It was a web of rituals, sounds, and images that permeated everyday life. And as we imagine this web, we can still find peace within it today. For in the repetitions, in the prayers, in the sound of bells, lies something comforting, something that transcends time. In the Middle Ages, the day drew to a close as the sun slowly set. There was no electric light to dispel the night, no hum of streetlights, no glow of screens. Darkness fell swiftly as soon as the last light disappeared behind the hills. And with that darkness came stillness, a deep stillness that enveloped everything. Imagine you are standing on the edge of a village. The fields lie still. Only the chirping of crickets fills the air. The first stars appear in the sky, shining clearly, brighter than we know them today. The houses in the village cast soft light from small windows. Candles flicker inside. Smoke rises from a chimney, carried by the evening breeze. The evening began with the last meal of the day. It was not a grand feast, but a simple meal. A pot of stew sat over the fire, filled with vegetables, grains, and sometimes a piece of meat. There was bread, perhaps some cheese or dried fruit. The family sat together, shared the food, and talked about their day. Children recounted small adventures. Adults spoke of their work. The crackling of the fire mingled with their voices, and a warmth filled the air that was more than the heat of the flames. After the meal, the quiet time began. The women cleared away the dishes, and the men perhaps checked on the livestock one last time. The soft moo of a cow, the bark of a dog, the last shouts across the village square could be heard. Then silence settled over the community, slowly, like a draped cloth descending. Inside, the family gathered around the hearth. The fire burned lower, casting shadows on the walls. Children huddled closer together, seeking the warmth. In this hour, stories were told. Stories of saints, of miracles, of kings and heroes, but also fairy tales, legends, simple stories that soothed the heart. The voices were calm, solemn, sometimes almost like a song. The children listened, their eyes grew heavy, and slowly they drifted off to sleep. The night in the Middle Ages was deeper, darker than we know it. Without lamps, without streetlights, the sky was a vast blanket full of stars. One could hear the rustling of the wind in the trees, the creaking of wood, perhaps the howl of a wolf in the distance. But all this belonged to the night, was familiar, not threatening. The darkness was like a cloak that protected the village. Sleeping often meant lying close together. Families shared beds to keep warm. The beds were made of straw, covered with woolen blankets. One smelled the scent of the straw, heard the rustling when one moved. The proximity provided security, and while the night raged outside, people found peace inside. Before falling asleep, people often said a final prayer. They were simple words, words of thanks, of asking for protection. Perhaps the Lord's Prayer, perhaps a quiet murmur. These prayers were like a key that unlocked the door to the night. They offered comfort, a sense of peace. The hours of the night passed silently. No artificial light disturbed sleep. No noise interrupted the peace. Only the crackling of embers, the soft breathing of those sleeping, the distant call of a night bird. Sleep was deep, connected to the rhythms of nature. Imagine yourself lying in one of these houses. The darkness is complete. Only the faint glow of dying embers flickers in the hearth. Beside you, you hear the calm breathing of your family, the steady beating of a hearth. Outside, the wind sings, and the sky above is full of stars. It is a sleep not accompanied by distant dreams, but by the closeness of life, by the simplicity of being. And so the day ended in the Middle Ages, not with the roar of machines, not with the whir of electrical devices, but with silence, with candlelight, with stories, with prayers, with a darkness that did not inspire fear, but offered protection. A day that had been hard found its end in peace, in community, in security. When we reflect on this today, we might feel a touch of longing for a night that is truly dark, for a sky full of stars, for a silence that sustains us. The Middle Ages may have been full of hardship, but in its evenings and nights there was also something comforting, something that resonates to this day. And so we close this day, this glimpse into a bygone world. A world that was simple, harsh, and yet rich in rituals and closeness. As we contemplate these images, the fire, the voices, the stars, we ourselves are allowed to find peace. The night spreads, quietly, gently. And perhaps, as the words slowly fade away, your eyes grow heavier, your breathing becomes calmer, and you find, like the people of old, peace in sleep.